One. Guys, what's happening? Zach Evanish here. Welcome back to another episode of the Strong Life Podcast. We got my friend Raph Ruiz down in Florida, and I met Raph about 11 years ago in Connecticut. I don't know if you remember, Raph. You guys were doing the early days CrossFit football. You were at, I don't recall his last name. His first name was Ben. He was like a rugby guy, and you guys were doing early days CrossFit. I remember you kind of going over notes from your iPhone, and that was my first meeting with you and John. I came up to John and I gave him this book right here. I actually keep it on my desk. This was all the original Westside Barbell articles. I don't know if he showed it to you when you were there. It's the original Westside Barbell articles from Muscle Builder and Power. But anyway, man, we've known each other for over a decade. I mean, time flies. I've seen you doing a lot of different stuff, so we're going to share a little bit of your history, which you have a lot of, and talk a little bit about what you got going on now. So, you know, from where I kind of heard about you and found out about you, Raph, was John spoke about you a lot as you were the guy that brought him back after he had the patella rupture, I believe, and it was like his early games of the NFL, and somehow, some way, he found out about you, and I'm not sure if in that was early 2000s, if you were working at one of the universities or if you were in the private sector already. You've been, like me, in a lot of different arenas. So can we go back to some early days? I don't know too many people who have done that history with you, minus John on his podcast.
Absolutely. When I first started, when I left Sam Houston State University, I graduated. Actually, before graduation, I got an offer to join the staff with the Buccaneers. And so I ended up, I sprinted down here, didn't even get to walk in my own graduation because they were basically saying, hey, as soon as this is over, you need to hustle over and get to work. And so that's what I ended up doing. I sprinted to Tampa from Texas. And eventually I got here. I spent a couple years on that staff. A job opened up with baseball, and they said, hey, here's a job over with the Rays. I went to go take that job, and I actually wasn't even done with school yet as far as my internship was concerned. And I took the job, but then my internship coordinator called me and said, hey, you had a commitment with this other place, you've got to finish it. And so they actually made me walk away, even though that was one of my goals that I expressed with them. And so I was heartbroken. I had to walk away from having that goal right here in my hands. And I ended up leaving that. Once I finished with my internship requirements, a job with the Mutiny, with the MLS team opened up. I ended up taking that job, and lo and behold, the league contracted that team that year. And so I didn't have a job, but during that time, one of the agreements was that I could bring in my professional athletes.
At the where was Mutiny located? Was that Florida?
It was in Tampa. And
you're a Texas guy, and it's like now I'm like, we don't get to chat enough. So a lot of these things kind of like, it's like bullets flying over my head right now. And I'm like, damn, I forgot that you were a Texas guy and you played college football, right?
I did. I played at Sam Houston State. I was a receiver out there.
Okay. What division is that university?
1AA. So now it's I believe they refer to it as the championship series. So it's the small big schools.
Yeah. And so growing up you grew up in Texas?
I grew up in Texas, so from about middle school on up, I've been living Texas lifestyle.
Right. So football is God in Texas, right? That's like that is the thing. Talk to us. Let's go back before we jump on kind of like career path. What was strength and conditioning looking like when you were in Texas high school?
It was interesting. There was a mix and match. I was fortunate that we had a really good program. So just like everywhere else in the country you go to, there's a lot of highs and lows. I happened to be at in Killeen Ellison, which was a football powerhouse. but we also were a track powerhouse. And so I talk about this all the time to young strength conditioning coaches growing up. I was thrust into this field, and I was very fortunate to have that background of Texas football. If you're working with football as a strength and conditioning coach, or if you're a strength and conditioning coach, having an advantage of working with the huge comprehensive demands that football requires, it is a huge leg up on people who've never played football, who've never worked with football. And then being a track athlete, our field is dominated by people who can make people run faster.
Right.
And so in that regards, we had a really good program. We're still at the grinder stage. Obviously, it's one of those situations where, just beat somebody to a pulp. But I happened to be at, like I said, a school that was really, really good with speed development. So we were really balanced with, okay, we're going to grind, but because we're a track powerhouse, we need to learn how to run faster. And so there was a really, really interesting mix between the two.
We'll talk about the track coach then. The track coach was doing a lot of technique work, or just I'm assuming you were a spring track sprinter. So what was some of because I think, are you in your 40s yet? You always look like you're 21, yeah. So it's very confusing for everybody. So probably, you graduate high school in like early mid 90s, and, back then, even when I got into strength and conditioning, I remember training a shot putter, and him, along with the whole spring track team, no matter what you did a 5K warm up. So this kid was like 240, and he was just like getting weaker. And I was like, yeah, you're running 3 miles every day as the warm up, while the track coaches kind of kill time, wait for everybody to get back. And so what was your track coach doing that you feel was on point? We're talking almost 25 years ago or so.
Absolutely. Well, it's interesting because there's a positives and negatives to everything. In Texas at that time, and granted, this could be completely different, but these could be old war stories. But where we went to school, if you played varsity football, that was your third period class. So if you were a varsity athlete, that was a class that the coaches put you in.
For right, what, strength and conditioning?
Correct. So if you were in varsity football, you watched film or you lifted in third period just prior to having lunch, fourth period. And then the beautiful part about that was if you ran varsity track, you had that scheduled into your schedule as your seventh period.
Very smart. Decades ahead of even still I've seen what's going on in Texas now just because I'm in the industry, the game, but still like in New Jersey, and I think maybe down south they're doing this, in like Georgia, maybe Florida. They have strength and conditioning for varsity athletes as part of curriculum. But I'm full-time at a high school strength coach, and that's our big struggle is if the team is not training immediately after school, they don't want to come for the second or third group after school because of all this traveling. So Texas figured it out 30 years ago. And they had you guys training during school.
Absolutely. And it worked really well. You got that in, then you went to go eat. So you talk about the perfect scenario.
Sure.
And as a senior, I remember you could schedule in a work release. So you were afforded a work release. So my senior year was super, super cushy in terms of my scheduling. And so it gave me an opportunity to almost train in that perfect world scenario where you show up an hour late. My next class was like home ec, where we cooked breakfast.
Yep.
So literally come to cook breakfast, and then you go and train, and then you got released for lunch. And then in the afternoon, our coach was really big with technique. So it ended up being one of those situations young athletes need to learn. The more engaged, the more mindful you are of trying to develop technique, the more engagement that you in
Raph,
turn.
hold on 1 second. Hang
Yes,
tight.
sir.
What do you need?
Help with the bike because there's a huge truck blocking the garage. I can't even get it.
Your bike is in Jay's backyard. Sorry, my man. We're having like a brand new roof going. My daughter's trying to get out of the house, family stuff. I don't edit that stuff out either, man. I just need people to
Leave it.
realize how real that stuff is.
Absolutely. Leave
So
it.
you're talking about your track coach being very technical, which
He's
is interesting because I still don't see it to this day. I see a lot of kind of like everybody does the same thing, and it's kind of like killing time and nothing really technical. And so kind of those who are succeeding in high school, at least in running, are just they're genetically gifted, not necessarily they don't know how to run faster. They're just faster, stronger, better, more fit. So what were some of the big takeaways you started learning? You're a teenager and you got a great program going at this high school.
Well, number one was because our program was so good, the first lesson ever taught to me that I carried away was culture. If you want to be fast, you literally have to surround yourself with people that have that same mindset. Because there's nothing, I don't care who you are, I don't care how gifted you are, it gets very difficult to not lose your edge, to not fall into that complacency. And the moment that I remember as a 13, 14-year-old walking into there as a pretty quick guy, but then we had juniors and seniors that were 10, 300 guys. I mean, they were just world class fast. They were always vying for a state championship. And so walking into that situation as an eighth grader training to come into the high school level of just seeing that work ethic, seeing guys that for the last 8 years have built a program of, if you're not going to run fast, we're going to replace you on the sprint relay.
Success breeds success.
And that's exactly it. So that was the very first lesson was that. And then our coach, Coach Neely, was really big into teach technique and then challenge your ability to maintain good technique.
That's high level.
And that was a huge thing for him. The moment that your technique started to falter, he would almost have that subtle kind of Tony Dungy way of saying, hey, go have a seat, and either think about holding technique better or get a rest and come back to hold technique better.
Very Charlie Francis-esque.
Very, very much so.
Very, very interesting. So you got football, spring track, okay? It's like a Herschel Walker program here already. Okay. What about, looking back at training? We have a lot of coaches who train high school athletes, or they have like the private sector gym like myself. So talk about what did introduction to high school training look like for you, and kind of, we'll get into a little bit of the people that you're training. I don't know how many high school athletes you're training now. You're at the private sector. I see videos, but I'm not sure how many high school kids you've trained. So talk about kind of what you went through and maybe how that influenced you in a right or wrong way to do what you do now.
Well, the second takeaway is, and it's always interesting, you and I have been in the game long enough to understand that when somebody eventually accomplishes a huge amount and they're standing on the podium and they've walked away from the game and they always talk about regrets. What did I learn? What are some of the things that I wish I would have done better? And it's always that moment that's always interesting to me, because I wish I would have enjoyed the process more. I wish I would have, which wholeheartedly, I think that is a fantastic and that's a beautiful thing. But I always remember that it's that grind. It's that struggle. It's that times that absolutely suck where you didn't enjoy it. It wasn't like this great, fantastic, I remember sitting there enjoying throwing up. I remember sitting there enjoying scraping all of the skin off of my shins, trying to do box jumps for days. And so what I want to tell those young coaches is you almost have to find that happy medium between coaching with that bullwhip, being able to drive them to learn how to push through some adversity, because coaching a high school athlete is 100% completely different in terms of dealing with the maturity versus somebody who's already got their foot in the door, who's already on that boat. And so teaching an athlete how to grind, but also teaching them how to find that eventual point where they can appreciate it, not necessarily having to 100% appreciate it at that moment. And that's a hard process to do. That's a very difficult thing to teach.
Yeah, Wellborn was talking about it with the guys on one of their recent episodes about, I think they did the Q&A. Somebody was asking, hey, how do you work with a high school kid who, like he's there, it seems like he doesn't really want to win. And then John said, you kind of got these like two scenarios. You got one kid where like all he thinks about is the sport and the winning, and he has no balance, and sometimes they kind of start checking out. And then you have other kids, I can't remember exactly how they phrased it, but what ran through my mind was you have some athletes who don't want it. They don't want to win. They're just happy being part of the team. Sometimes you have some kids in the middle, but, I tend to just work with the kids who really want to win. And so I guess you being in that Texas school was like the culture. It's like people don't, when you're in that kind of culture, like winning culture, and you don't know any different. You just think you're supposed to be training your ass off.
Correct. Absolutely. 100%. And that fact gets trimmed pretty quick. They figure it out pretty quick. But what's also interesting is the longer I stayed in the game as somebody who ended up coaching at both ends of the spectrum, where you have the introduction and somebody has never, this is their day one, versus working with somebody who's at the pinnacle. Even at the Olympic swim level, one of the things I noticed was that we had athletes who I had a couple of athletes on the track side and the swimming side who never really were dominant in college. And it was a really interesting, eye-opening moment for me listening to them talk was, hey, I didn't win until my senior year. And then now, 8 years later, they're gold medalists. And it's a really interesting psyche where first, I think you have to recognize talent. You have to recognize the anthropometrics. You have to recognize, okay, this person might not be 100% into it, but they're 6'5", but they are blessed with speed. And you almost have to take a different approach with them to say, listen, just stay in the fight, stay in the game, keep them around long enough, kind of teeter them over the edge, bring them back, teeter them over the edge, bring them back. And then maybe one day, when it could be something as all other options, maybe their degree didn't pan out, maybe something didn't do right or whatever. And next thing you know, they're like, yeah, let me give this Olympic swimming a shot.
It's interesting that, and we're going to let's give people some context. Then we're going to kind of talk about this mindset of the athlete. So context being, we jumped around a little. I got the ADD with that. So you were at the college sector coaching, right? Then yep. What was the pro soccer team? You wanted you, but then you had to finish.
Well, we started the year, and then they called us all together, and the GM said, "I'm sorry, guys, but the MLS has decided that to contract two teams because they obviously couldn't handle that, and one of the teams was us, and so they literally sent everybody packing, literally all the players, everybody just kind of go your own way." And at that point in time, I had pro athletes coming in. Agents had called me.
They were coming into the soccer place you were training at.
Coming into the soccer place.
How did they find out about you? What were you, like, how did even the first pro athlete outside of soccer sport find out about you and say, hey, we could train with this guy? And what year is this also, by the way?
I want to say it's the late 90s, because I came here in like the mid 90s, and I don't remember the exact year, but it was towards the back half of that decade. And all of a sudden, when I was in college, Coach Ben Pollard had given me the green light to start working with speed development because of my background.
Yep.
And hey, go ahead and help some of these guys. And we were 1AA. We didn't have a lot of big name talent going into the draft, but we had some guys that were getting looks.
Yep.
So if you want to take those guys and work with them.
Gotcha.
We ended up having a guy, John Solomon, who responded awesomely to the program, got drafted by the Packers, and a couple of guys followed after that. And I was still an undergrad finishing my degree.
Training guys for the combine.
Still training guys for the combine. And I remember a couple of their agents were the first ones to call me, and they said, "Hey, you did awesome. Would it be okay next year if guys?" And so those were the guys that ended up calling me when I came to Tampa, and they were like, "Hey, I've got 2 guys coming through the draft. Can you get them ready?"
So when you got to Tampa, it was with soccer first or the university level first?
So it was those 3 pro teams.
Yep.
I didn't have a home, and all of a sudden I get a call on the soccer side. Coach Keith Folk was the men's soccer coach at the University of Tampa, and he said, "Hey, can you come train my guys?" And that kind of got my foot in the door there. I had 2 or 3 teams that trained with me. There was an existing guy there that kind of was a private contractor guy. And then after that, the other teams, they kind of parted ways with him, and they said, "Hey, can you train all the teams there?" And that was the agreement was, "Hey, I'll work with your teams if I could train my pro athletes here."
What's so, a lot of stuff running through my mind. It's the 90s, the late 90s. You still didn't hear the phrase strength and conditioning. You still heard, "I'm a personal trainer, I'm a trainer." I still think like some of the big universities were using HIIT training. Like Penn State was still a HIIT team. So in the late 90s, I didn't get into this, Raph, till like 2002. And so my initial foray getting into it was a lot of like Juan Carlos Santana type work, which I really connected with his stuff. He was pretty aggressive, even though he was using, the physio balls, but he was doing dumbbell snatches and complexes, and I liked what he was doing. Actually, I remember speaking to him some years ago. He got out of that whole perform better thing. He's like, "Because I'm sick of everybody going so corrective. People don't even train anymore." He's like, "I don't want nothing to do with this." So late 90s, what did your training look like, and who was, the internet is very new. Who are you learning from in the late 90s to kind of shape your training methodology?
I kind of took a different route for me, and it's interesting that you mentioned him. People always ask me, my program was built off of 3 major components. Number 1 was football. Not as in order of importance, but I would say football was a huge influence in developing the program. Speed development was obviously huge, and just like Juan Carlos was martial arts.
Yes.
And the balance between those 3 was really, really big for me. Eventually, the 4th component became swimming. And swimming was a huge shift in the paradigm for me, but it really sided with the martial arts in terms of, okay, you have you ever read the book Effortless Power?
No, I don't even know if I've heard it.
Martial arts book. And it's kind of that, I don't remember who it was based off of, but this was written way back in the 80s and 90s, and I ended up reading it earlier in my career, and it was about one of the guys, kind of like that Van Damme blood sport thing where the American goes and he wins.
Effortless Power?
Effortless Power. And he really talks about developing the mindset and the training of not just the application of force, but being able to whittle away all of the things that don't allow you to express force. So kind of finding that efficiency and power application.
What's your martial arts background, though?
It's a Filipino combat system, so kali, knife, stick fight, which is what I grew up with, and then Muay Thai.
Yeah, I thought Muay Thai, yep.
So finding that happy medium in striking and being able to, if something didn't allow me to strike harder or allow me to move, to not get hit, but also still be in position to strike.
Position, yeah.
And then that becomes a different thing that that swimming started to add to. So the more swimming you get involved in, not only yourself doing it, but the more you coach it, you start to recognize that the Western approach to strength and conditioning was harming our ability to swim well, and that's based off of efficiency. So can I develop power in the water? But if the power takes away from my ability to maintain good body positioning, which would mean hydrodynamic efficiency, then we had to scrap it. So it really changed my focus on how I was going to get athletes to perform, not just at a high level, but sustainability. Can they sustain this?
Sustain it. So now we're at University of Tampa, right?
And for about 10 years.
10 years. Were you with football or were you Olympic sports?
And that was the thing. We had everything but football. They had a prominent football program way back in the 50s and 60s. John Solomon, guys like that who did really well, but they got rid of their football program. But I always had I always got to wet my whistle because all of our pros would come in and train in the spring and the summer. Draft prep, we did a big draft prep every year, and then all the guys would come back and literally until about July, August, when they eventually went to their OTAs, we got to do a bunch of football. So it kind of kept my wheels greased up with that.
So you're there for 10 years, and I guess I'm assuming like one of the guys that John was connected with, or a player after his injury, they said, you got to go work with this guy?
His agent called me. His agent called around and said, because of our approach wasn't just about Hulk smash, it was that finding that careful balance of hold a position, protect a position, prevent some injuries, all the while maintaining that balance of Hulk smash. And I think that a lot has to do with that mix between what we just talked about is I want to hit for power, but I also want to be able to make sure that I can hit for power repetitively, continuously over time. And that required a little bit of finagling of injury prevention and sustainability.
I think when John had ever mentions when he first worked with you, he's like, I can't remember he said. I didn't touch a weight for I don't know how long. He's like, but the first time, he's like, I got killed, and it was all just like holding positions. And I guess that's where like he's so big on the dead bugs and the Captain Morgans and things like that.
Yeah.
That's what he always talks about, like challenge, posture, and position. And now I'm like remembering listening to you in Connecticut, and I just remember you talking about that. And I'll be honest with you, I think I wasn't ready to hear that kind of stuff at the time because I hadn't been really injured yet. Minus, I had injured my knee before I had an ACL surgery. But like sometimes we don't pick up on what people say until it's the right time. Like we haven't been hurt enough. Hurt enough could be not just an injury, but let's say I'm a coach who has had a losing season consistently. Then he starts becoming more of a listener and more coachable as a coach. So it's like, the timing of it. So where did, was it the martial arts with like the isometric holds got to you, or where did you pick up on that?
It was actually both. It's just like you said, I started to put a lot of things together. I started to piece things together. I was never hurt either, but I wanted to, and because I'd never been hurt, I didn't want that to be a hole, so to speak, in the way that I approach programming. We had some high-level guys, some guys that were predicted to get drafted, and one of our guys in particular blew his knee out. And I remember
ACL or patella rupture.
Yeah, he completely tore his ACL, like shattered his knee.
Jeez.
And it ended up being one of those situations where I said, I committed and I said, listen, Steve, I'm going to go with you every single day and we're going to get through this and I'm going to walk you through this. And so what we ended up doing was going through this whole program of ACL and watching this guy absolutely go from a monster, just an absolute monster, to a shell of himself, watching a guy weep trying to do a bodyweight squat. And I used to look at certain things. And I said, you know what? I don't want my athletes to go through that. And so I started to reverse engineer and talking with the doctors of saying, hey, what are the mechanisms of an ACL tear? How does the LCL tear? How does the MCL tear? How does the PCL tear? And so as I started to go through there, they would take me through these anatomical diagrams and these models, and they would say, okay, if the tibial plateau slips forward excessively while the femur is twisting. And I said, okay, so I need to prevent the tibial plateau from sliding. And then I would work back from there. How do you prevent the tibial plateau from sliding? It's the equal pull from both heads of the hamstring on the medial and the lateral side. And so all of a sudden things started to click of saying, okay, if I can hold it in position with the correct amount of tension, then hopefully I can give an athlete just a little bit better chance of preventing it from getting to there. So if all of a sudden he feels it going, and the dampening spring that we call it can be more reactive and go, oh, no, don't go that far. And now all of a sudden I found that I can have an athlete that prevents an ACL tear. But what we found was athletes were becoming quicker because of that riding effect, because they weren't sagging on their change of direction. They weren't sagging on their plant. They weren't sagging on their runs. And it was just like this huge aha moment for me that I said, if I went the other way and just worked on performance and get guys super, super strong, they're still prone to injuries. But if I can get a guy who's less prone to injuries, consequently, I was getting guys who were performing better. And it just, all of a sudden, I took everything that I knew and I went in with the idea, Raph, question it. And then there were so many holes in my program. I was like, I was doing this because it's always been done that way. I was doing that because it's always been taught to me.
What do you think were big holes in your program looking at those late 90s, early 2000 era?
It was, for me, I put too much emphasis on, I put priority on force production. That was the biggest thing for me was, okay, an isolated muscle just does the body and moves it in this way. But one of the things that if I took a reverse approach and said, okay, how does a muscle get injured? And it really came to circle back around was in biomechanics, a lot of people forget that it's called an anticipatory tuner. And your body will anticipate a movement, a motion according to what's been done before. So if you're used to squatting and your body wants to address a problem by squatting, your body puts yourself in that position and it works a constant loop of feet forward, feet backward. So it says, okay, I've done a squat 1,000,000 times. This is what it's supposed to feel like. And then your body goes, compare it to what is happening now. Okay, make an adjustment. Okay, are you doing it? Make an adjustment. Are you doing? And it does it at a trillion times a moment at super lightning fast speeds. And so what ends up happening is that anticipatory tuner, number one, there has to be plasticity to it. So your body has to know what a good change of direction is supposed to feel like. Because if you're used to only doing sumo squats, well, that is your plasticity. That is the way that your body will address it. And so if you're used to going super wide, knees out, toes out, and if that's what you want to do, then that's fine. But understand that that's how your body is going to address a problem. And so the moment that happens, if I'm running and I plant, then all of a sudden the knee is preventing something, or it's going to go according to the habit that you've built and whatever that habit is.
Right.
And so your body is constantly evaluating, repositioning, but it's that isometric initial anticipation of put yourself in that position, and then your body will fight to try to protect that position. It might be inertia that takes you out of it. It might be an opponent. It might be a slippery surface, but your body is always trying to fight. And so what ends up happening is two things. There's a yielding isometric, which happens to be what we call a true eccentric. And that's the other thing that really changed my perception, my perspective of what we used to do, what we learned in college versus what really happens. And that's you learn basic muscle physiology of, okay, here's a here's a shortening, here's a hold, and here's a lengthening. But the way that the body works in a hyperfast arena is here's a shortening to get to a position. Here's an isometric where your body's trying to hold, but that blends into a true eccentric, which is the amount of force I can produce isn't enough to overcome the force that's being placed on it, which is completely different than me just lowering from a pull-up, because that would be me just turning the volume down.
If just you talking about that stuff like brings to mind, I start almost hearing like Cal Dietz talking about, he goes through the triphasic. So he's got the eccentrics, he's got the isometrics, and then what's the third thing that he does? He's got the eccentric, the isometric,
the concentric, just the coming up.
Yeah, being explosive with movements.
Yeah.
In the late 90s, when I was bodybuilding, I remember one of the trainers at the gym, he had us go through these heavy eccentrics, and I think Charles Poliquin had written about it in remember Muscle Media magazine. So
Absolutely.
let's say I still remember my training partner, like he'd incline bench 275 on the Smith machine. We were bodybuilding, and let's say he did 8 reps. Then we put a 45 on each side, so we have 365. And then it was always 3, like, fight as hard as you can, eccentrics, partner, lift it up. But, like, we would do it on triceps. We would do it on seated calf raises. We were doing it on so much stuff. It beat the crap out of me because, everybody I trained with was on some sort of, they were on steroids. So they were just cruising through it. I always wonder if, like, Cal read that back then because he's kind of our age and has been around these phases. So, here you are kind of looking at movement, whereas nobody was really doing that in the early 2000s. I mean, the early 2000s, Raph, as you remember, I remind people is that functional training became this new phrase, and if you weren't training on a physio ball or a balance disc, if you weren't on one leg, like, you were doing it wrong. So where were you? What did a training day perhaps look like for any athlete in those early 2000s? Did you get caught up in any of that stuff?
You know what? For me, it was perfect timing as a lot of the functional training. So for me, I always came back to my initial response was if I continue to reverse engineer.
Yep.
So my reverse engineering is, can I make somebody run faster? Can I make them change directions? And that was my early focus, obviously working with football players. So can I get them to run faster? Can I change directions? And so I worked from there to figure out, okay, these are the protocols that somebody was doing. Now, how do I get them? Because at that point in time, there wasn't a huge bridge between the two. It was you tear your ACL, you sit with a physical therapist, do a bunch of knee extensions
right.
until somebody said that your quadriceps were both the same size, and then you got released.
Yeah.
There was never a mix between the two. And that's what I learned was, how can I bridge the gap to make sure that somebody left PT and then they were going to seamlessly integrate into what we were doing. And so when in the early 2000s, when a lot of that came about, I was very fortunate that I was already thrust into pro football and pro baseball. Pro baseball is highly anti-injury. Everything is about don't do anything to injure these guys. If they're in your weight room and they get injured, heads are going to roll. And so for me, even though there were people balancing on a Bosu ball or a stability ball and doing all this crazy stuff, I always had to check and balance of saying, listen, functional training's great, but I can't go back and say, hey, Skip, John Smith was squatting on a stability ball and now he's concussed. So our $20 million pitcher is no longer available.
Well, early 2000s baseball, like 2000 was when Mark McGuire broke the, because I remember I was an elementary phys ed teacher, and one of the kids for, I think Christmas, they give gifts. So for the holiday gifts, he gave me the newspaper with Mark McGuire on the cover. just laughing because, I can't remember what, steroid he admitted to being on or whatnot, but I think those guys were training very much like bodybuilding. Like they would do like chest and buys and shoulders.
100%.
Yeah, so it was such a confusing era, and it's interesting to hear that you were like, all right, man, I'm going to take in this information, but what I'm really going to look at is movement and how do they get injured and how do you just, what I don't want to underplay it, but it's like, to me, that's common sense. Not using common sense was like, I was so influenced by Mike Boyle's voice. He's this big name in the fitness industry, and the cover of his book shows somebody training on that Reebok, whatever the hell that thing was, that core trainer. And I'm like, well, man, if I don't have my guys standing on these wobble boards, like I must be doing something wrong. And it was it was an annoying time. That's what like pisses me off about it. So now let's kind of jump forward to this, Raph. So Johnny Wellborn shows up, huge, strong guy, and his agent reaches out to you. And what's running through your head when you've got to help this guy who was it his patella was ruptured? And
He ruptured his patella.
He
had ruptured his patella his first year.
Yep.
So he ended up responding really well. He ended up doing well as a mid to low draftee, and then he stepped up because he's a skill guy. I mean, he had unbelievable skill, but I remember his agent telling me that he was labeled as unathletic. That was his knock. That hey, we like this guy's skill, but he's tight-hipped and he's unathletic.
Yep.
And that's what knocked him down on the draft board.
That's funny because he talks about boxing. And I'm like, I don't recall him saying he learned boxing out in California. So now, like, I'm wondering maybe Raph taught him, how to work the hands.
Yeah, when he was younger, he did a bunch of boxing with the guys that he trained with and with his brothers. Obviously, two big older brothers probably just beat the snot out of each other.
Bare knuckle boxing. So you see him. He's got this, he's coming to you after patella rupture repair. And from what I understand, like, a patella rupture, if he's coming in the off season, I guess he's got half a year to work with you, right?
Yeah.
That's not a whole lot of time.
Early, that was one of those situations where he wasn't going to make that recovery process before rejoining. So we had a little bit longer to work with him at that point in time. So he obviously wasn't joining the team in the playoffs, and they gave him an opportunity to say, you know what, let's go take care of this. We like you.
Yep.
And if you can address this, if you can fix this, then we're going to give you a good shot.
So what did that kind of look like in the beginning? You have a big guy. He mentioned not touching any weights for a certain amount of time. What does a training session start looking like for somebody like him coming out of, you have the hearsay of he's unathletic, his hips are tight, and, patella rupture repair. So what's that start looking like?
Well, this comes back to what we just were talking about is I've always been rebellious in nature. And it ends up being one of those situations where I'm stubborn to a fault. And I'm so stubborn that to the point where, I'm like, everybody get out of my way. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it on my own. Even though there might be a better way, even though somebody offers me a solution, I'm saying, hey, we already invented the wheel. I'm going to be like, nope, I'm going to give me a hammer and a chisel and I'm going to go grind out my own wheel just to prove you wrong or just to prove that I can do it. And so in this instance, a lot of the people have a lot of influences out there. For me, it was always, no, I want to figure this out on my own. And almost to the point where I said, don't tell me, let me figure this out, because if I could do that, it would make more sense to put those pieces of the puzzle together on my own. And it really worked out that way. So in that instance, when a big John Wellborn shows up, I always went in with the idea that this is square one. Let's figure out what movement pattern he's not doing well. And the way I started to equate that was the letters of the alphabet. And I started to say, okay, how should the pelvis move? How should the shoulders move? And literally taking the old anatomy books and saying, this is how the spine and the neck and everything should move. And then kind of assigning that letters and saying, okay, what letters is somebody missing? Because if they're missing letters, they're trying to still talk, but they might be missing a vowel. And so, yeah, you and I can still talk, and I might be missing the letter E. I could still communicate with you, but it won't be as fluid. It won't be as eloquent. It won't be to the capacity that if I had all of the letters available to me.
Right. So let's break it down for people. You're going to do an assessment of him. I don't know if this is similar to an assessment of anybody. He's coming in after a very serious knee surgery. What does the assessment movement look like?
So we basically start with the feet. For me, it's always been about the feet. From day one, it's always, let's see what the feet are doing. Let's see if he has fallen arches. Let's see if his feet are flat, if he has a good arch. Let's see if he can keep his foot flat, and what kind of range of motion can the ankle move without breaking, without losing contact. And from there, we start looking at the obviously the ankle, and then we skip the knee and we go to the hip.
So you make him take his shoes off? Is that first thing?
Yeah, take the shoes off and literally just,
We can't do that in college. That's what's, you're in the college weight room. We can't have a bunch of kids training barefoot. And what's also interesting is, the last university I was at, they were sponsored by, I think, Adidas. And, the shoes they had were horrible.
Oh, God.
Yeah, they were very, fat heels. And I was like, we can't squat with this. I was like, guys, on lower body day, just come in with your wrestling shoes.
Absolutely.
Yeah, they were horrible. So, all right, you get them to take. It's interesting too because as I got smarter with coaching, and it certainly was not the early days, I always look at people's feet. I mean, I look at people's feet and the way their feet. I always say coaches do this. We're out to eat, you're waiting online, and you kind of look at people's posture. You look at their feet, are the toes turned out, and you're like, oh man, that's an knee injury, or that guy can't be fast.
Absolutely.
His toes are out, and it's soccer players tend to have kind of because they're always kicking with their instep. But
yeah,
you see these people walking with the feet out. It's interesting. Although there's always outliers. We see some very high-level athletes with flat feet, collapsed arches, and you're like, what the hell? Weird.
Well, because you start to, and that's the thing, you realize when you're in long enough that if you were to take everything, kind of like you would look at an equalizer with a sound system, somebody may be so gifted in a certain area that it makes up for a lot of the low-lying in other areas. You may be genetically defective feet and ankles, but maybe you're super strong and you can manhandle somebody. And so it can hide, it could really compensate and hide some things that are occurring. So yeah, we have some terrible athletes that people go, there's no way that is, we'll have athletes that train, and especially with a game of football, where they're helmets. So all of a sudden people are like, who is that guy? And I'm like, oh, that's, John Smith. They're like, no, it's not. Number 53 for so-and-so. I'm like, yeah, that's him. God, he looks terrible. I'm like, yeah, well, the guy, he may have, for instance, we talk about this all the time. As players come in, they have a good physicality, but they start replacing it. I was very blessed to be part of the Buck system, where all of a sudden you watch somebody towards the end of their career, and it's like, okay, they might have lost a step physically, but their football IQ is through the roof now.
And we're gonna tackle that because we still got to get back to those swimmers that you were working with at the Olympic level. So let's go back to kind of this. You're assessing John. You look at the feet, the ankles. You skip the knees and go to the hips. What are the hips? Are you looking at? Can he do a deep squat below parallel? How are you assessing hip action?
We're looking at his range of motion of his squatting. We're looking at, obviously, the lunging to see if he can swivel on that y-axis. And then on a step up, we're looking to see if his hips can tilt and tilt. Now, the last two are interesting because it goes into a regression with the squat is now, can we work through all three axes of rotation? But then we have to remember that that the right and the left can kind of interdependently move away from one another. So I may have a very, very aggressive motion where my hip may anteriorly pelvic may tilt, and then with a little bit of y-axis tilting in the other one. And so the hips moving in this gyroscopic fashion need to understand that there is a lot of play from right to left hip that you don't necessarily get with squatting. And so with some of our squat protocols, again, addressing that of saying, hey, here's one of the holes in our program. So then we started to get into how do we address that? So now all of a sudden, can we challenge the right and left hip on an x-axis? And we found that if we stagger the feet, if we slightly elevate a foot, where now the hip is here.
During squats?
You can put one up on a plate. You can get one up on a block. You can do it up on a step up.
I don't see anybody do that. You know who I see? The only guy I've seen do that is Ben Bruno. And Ben trains, celebrities. He does train some pro athletes. I'm assuming they're basketball because they're huge. But I've seen him do that kind of offset foot position for like a front squat. And, everything kind of come together now because I look at like, okay, this is why the guys love step-ups so much. I haven't seen the power athlete guys or really anybody doing these kind of feet offset. What would you call that squat? 1 foot elevated or offset squat?
So we have, if we start off in if you're looking from the floor up, we have our basic squat position. And then we have what we call our stagger, where both heels should stay down.
Okay.
We use it a lot because it really challenges that front Achilles, that front plantaris up underneath. So we originally started when we found athletes who couldn't squat to death because of lack of ankle mobility.
Oh, yeah. That's huge. I mean, I started noticing it a lot, I'd say around 2010. I feel like if I'm trying to pinpoint it, and I'm sure you must have really, because you've been around very long. So, the kids, when I first started training athletes in the early 2000s, I always tell people, I said, okay, 10 squats, bang, pull-ups, boom, sprint. They just could do it. And now it's like, fuck, you can't even do a bodyweight squat. And I remember James Smith saying, he goes, Zach, you know what that means? It means they can't take a shit. They can't even sit on a toilet bowl properly. He goes, that's how backwards we've gotten as a country. And I was like, woo, like I did not even put it like that. And, now also, I'm going to jump around a lot, Raph. I get like this because we do have a lot of listeners that are not coaches, kind of this median age of like mid-30s to mid-50s, a lot of listeners. And so we start kind of getting some of these, injuries. Like me, I'm dealing with something with my knee, and my knee felt slightly better. Do you know the guy John Brookfield, the power ropes guy, battle ropes guy?
Yeah.
John Welborn, of course. Every time he talks about battle ropes, he has something bad to say. But I interviewed John yesterday. He's 61, and he said, Zach, you know what? Like, helped me a lot. He's a big, religious guy, so he's reading the Bible a lot, and he talks about how everybody was sitting or squatting. He's like, so he spoke about just sitting with your legs straight in front of you, toes up, don't let the hips relax, flat back. And that's actually very hard for me. So like during this podcast, I'm
moving around,
sitting down, moving, but sitting with my legs out in front with good posture is very hard on my lower back and my hamstrings. And I'm like, this is horrible. I could squat and deadlift, but I can't sit with my legs out in front of me. So I'm sure like John being so big, coming from, he had the powerlifting background. Then Todd Rice trained him up with all the weightlifting, full range everything. So, but then he's coming out of surgery. He probably couldn't do a full squat when you saw him. Am I right?
Absolutely. Well, you have to remember, even all of those, the evolution of where we are is we've ingrained ourselves to chase metrics. And that's the hardest.
Meaning like attach. I was just speaking with my buddy who's in the NFL. Put the tendo unit on that. Put the perch up there. And it's like then everybody's chasing the thing, but then the technique is shit. It's
Correct.
really, and you, Raph, like, I want people who are listening and watching, I want them to start digging and watching your videos, because when I watch your videos, I hear you coaching. Like, it's like, this is a guy who can command the room. You're a coach. And look, no offense to the younger coaches out there, not all of them, but Joe Ken says it too. He's like, these young coaches, they could kind of manage 2 or 3 platforms, but they can't manage a full room. And so when you were at University of Tampa, I'm assuming it was like you, maybe an intern, maybe an assistant, maybe with like a shit ton of kids. I sometimes run groups of like 60 to 75 athletes.
Right.
It's huge.
Absolutely.
And so I hear you coaching. I want people to really seek out and research your channel, your Instagram, so they can hear it. So, the ability to kind of coach this, I guess, we'll focus on John here for a second. He you're taking him through an assessment. Was he able to squat fully? Had he done some rehab yet, or?
He did rehab, and you can tell that the proverbial wheels weren't greased. So you could see whether it's like, okay, squat up, and then little things were catching, little things were moving. You could kind of see where he's like, okay, if I position my foot a little bit different, then I can drop into the hole, which is a lot what we just talked about.
Sure.
Is if I chase metrics, he's a smart guy, and he knows how to find that position.
Right.
But if you were to watch somebody move and label the eloquence of something, the fluidity of something, you could tell that there were some hitches here and there. And so our job was to figure what we call transitional strength. Can you transition from hip position to hip position in the smoothest, the most efficient way possible? And to us, that meant somebody who was now in a better position to be able to withstand some forces.
So what are some of the body weight? He mentioned not touching weights with you for a bit. What were some of the things you were doing with him to get him to move?
Lunge complexes are huge for us, especially with the bigger athletes. We have, I don't even know what the number is now, but there's 50 or 60 different lunge variations that we'll do. But most importantly, not just the lunge, but can they transition from a lunge to a different type of motion? And that's for us was again, we say that a lot is transitional strength. Can you transition from a squat to a lunge? Can you do it at the bottom of a squat, from a squat to a lunge? And that really tells us somebody who can, if you can do it while maintaining good posture, good limb positioning, then that gives me a good green light, thumbs up for you to say, this person is ready. So it could be something as simple as a, step back into a backward lunge. Now, can you bring that back foot forward without rising up and set up in a good ready stance? And a lot of our athletes just can't do it when they first start out.
That is
can you
good.
Lateral lunge and then step feet together and step forward into another lunge without changing the position of your height. And that's a very, very difficult thing, but that's to us a good indicator, this person's ready to rock.
So we got a controlled eccentric movement, then we're isometrically holding position, and now we're moving into another position of concentric. And just, so much going through my mind, Raph. I know I could talk to you all day about this, but I mentioned technology, whether it's a Tendo. Now there's Perch, where, you're on this squat rack and you squat, and the camera, the iPad, judge it, tracks your speed. And then, let's say our boy Tex is on the other side, says, oh, Raph Ruiz squatted and so much, he squatted his weight in this many meters per second. Now I'm going to try to beat it. And so we're so connected to the technology, but like you mentioned, Muay Thai. And so, what that brings me, this next part was, I see some facilities, you probably come across the ad on your Instagram. It's like a person touching like lights.
Mm-hmm.
And I think to myself, I'm not in an athletic position. It's up here, and usually if I'm in athletics, unless I'm in volleyball or something's touching over my head. But, why not teach somebody like the hands and Muay Thai and just be, to me, and then you were mentioning baseball, like learning to use hips. And so my son he loves baseball. And I always think to myself, man, it's been a long time since I've done Muay Thai. But I was like, and my daughter's a big tennis player. So it's like, if they learn Muay Thai, they're
Huge.
learning, they're learning how to really orientate their body and such full body power and just the balls of the feet. Yeah. So, it's kind of like, do you ever feel like you're like, if you went into a university now and you started doing Muay Thai and this and that, like sometimes that's just too hard for people and they don't like that shit.
It is. It is a very difficult thing. You have to go in with the idea that sell the coaches.
Yeah.
If the coach starts to trust you, then they immediately start to go to bat, and you always start with them. Sorry,
Yep.
I take a huge step back. You start with your champions first. You figure out who the coaches love,
Yes.
and obviously going to be those star players. You get them to buy into what you're trying to do, and now you and the star player, who obviously the coach has a vested interest in, can now go to the coach and say, oh, Raph wants to try to do some Muay Thai. I think that'd be cool, as opposed to you just going in and trying to convince him. So work the champions first. The champion and you can get into both ears of the coach. And once the coaches start to do it, especially on your successful programs, I mean, I can't tell you how many times that the University of Tampa had made some positive adjustments because, the perennial national powerhouse volleyball coach was like, hey, we need this. And then next thing you know, everybody down the line was like, yeah, let's do this because they win. Let's go ahead and incorporate that.
Yeah, this is so good transition here now because we're talking about what does this champion athlete believe in, whether it's right or wrong. But if they believe in it, it boosts their performance. So now I remember when you were at the national, was this like the national swim team, the Olympic headquarters was in North Carolina where you were?
Oh, what they did a number of years back was USA Swimming broke it up to centers of excellence. And the way that USA Olympics is different than others is it's not a national quote unquote like China. If you're Olympic lifting, you go here. If you are track, you go here. Here it's wherever the coaches are. So if you love Bob Bowman, you're going to ASU. If you love David Marsh, you're going over to California. So wherever those coaches where they kind of set up areas.
Regional, yeah. They're kind of doing that with wrestling. The big universities have the regional training center, which is basically post-college. And what's interesting too is like now America is becoming more powerful in Olympic sports because we have these younger coaches, well, they were trained better. And so now we have these younger coaches who are trained by the better people. So we have better coaching. So now we rival. We were always so afraid of like the Soviets and the Germans because they had great coaches at the youth level. But now we're starting to get that.
Huge.
Yes, at the youth level.
Because here in America, I mean, and you see it this day, is every intern that comes to us, I always ask, what do you want out of this internship? And I want to train pro athletes. I want to train pros. I want to go work for the Bucks. And nobody ever says, I want to work with 8-year-olds. Yeah. Nobody ever says, I want to be an awesome high school coach. It isn't until you get to our stage where you're like, I spend all of my career trying to convince a pro elite level athlete to stretch. Maybe I can build that habit in an elementary school kid. And now all of a sudden that kid is set up for the rest of his life if he can appreciate some of the things that we never learned as
right. I follow some of the Instagram channels of the Russian wrestlers, and so there's this one guy. He won I can't remember how many gold medals in the Olympics he won. I think 2, maybe 3. I can't recall, but he won his last gold medal quite easily with gray hair. He had gray hair. He was like 36. Wow. Yeah, Sativ. But you see him working with their youth. with 8-year-olds, showing
That's
them. Yeah, so it's like,
huge.
exactly. So now here in America, I know with wrestling, we'll have like college kids who are all Americans or even national champions, or maybe they were a round away from all American, and then they're working with youth. And, going into this, this swim team that you're talking with. So you were working with guys that were prepping for Olympics and women, men and women?
And women's.
And so I've trained swimmers have been some of the strongest athletes I've worked with while having zero background in strength and conditioning. It's like and they're built. I mean, one kid, have to send you a photo of him. We trained him through in high school through like his junior year through senior year. He won the YMCA Nationals 50-meter fly.
Whew.
He was got so he was putting on muscle so fast. We went to training 3 days a week to 2 to 1 day a week. He looked like a bodybuilder. I mean, like we lowered volume. He just responded so much to it. But I feel like the swimming, that is the resistance. And then because the water makes you so hungry, they eat properly.
Oh,
yeah. So he got so big, and then unfortunately, when he got to college, I don't know, he stopped swimming, but he was at Penn State. I think he had a full ride. It was like,
wow.
Yeah, they said like one of the kids told him they're like he met a girl and that was it. But the swimmers have been really some of the most enjoyable for me to work with. They're very tough. I guess they're used to training at 6 a.m., jumping in a cold pool. Absolutely. And they're used to high volume of training.
And they're smart.
Very smart.
They understand.
Yeah.
The more, you could sit there and you could just say Mongo smash with any other athlete and they'll do that. But a swimmer will have that natural, how does this make me pull through the water? How does this help my position?
Yes.
And that changes things immensely when the athlete is asking questions.
Yeah, they say things like, whenever I lose, I tend to feel like I'm too fatigued. What's a pool? 25 meters? Is that what it won?
Normally it's a 20 or 50.
Okay, so I'm losing with this many meters. Can we do circuit work where circuit work, my swim time is, it takes me 2 minutes. Can I do these like hard 2-minute circuits? Some of the swimmers we've had have been great. One girl is at West Point, and she was just amazing. Yeah, just her work ethic and it was just they really impressed me. So you're with these swimmers. We're going to get into this.
How to suffer.
They know how to suffer. They're very, like you said, cerebral. They're kind of like calm about it. I mean, I guess this is a big reason why they say a lot of the SEALs tend to have a water polo or swim or wrestling background.
Absolutely.
And so what's interesting too is like you're talking about they're out of college, they were going to get into work, the job didn't fall through, and now they have this mental maturity. They're kind of like confident, they believe in themselves, they start knowing, and it's amazing how just believing in yourself helps the training result have a greater training effect. Like if you don't believe in it, just like if you believe in technology, then it's going to work better for you.
Right.
And that's why I think this younger generation likes a lot of the technology because that's what they've grown up on.
Well, there's an effort efficiency. There's a focus and a refocus. When you don't know, you don't take all of that brain power and drive it into something very narrow-minded. And there's something to be said about that. It's one of those things that I've had this talk with thousands of parents who have these huge aspirations for their son or daughter to be world class, this, that, and the third. And I always tell them, you need to keep in mind this could potentially ruin your child. And they always have that huge wide eye, like, what do you mean? I said, listen, we've worked with enough of them to know that their bodies at some point in time will break down from what they're about to put themselves through. Yeah. Mentally, psychologically, this, like what you watch on TV is the icing on the cake. What you don't see is the 23 hours of every day that they are just absolutely physically, mentally, and emotionally just crushing themselves.
It's a lot.
And I don't know a lot of them who come out of this unscathed. I mean, you talk about an athlete who's already predisposed to having hyper focus. Well, those are the same type of people who crash hard.
Well,
This ends up being an interesting recipe for disaster for a
sure.
lot of people.
You know, Michael Phelps had I don't know what the story was, but anyway, what he got caught smoking pot. I mean, that's actually a pretty normal thing for college kids. They smoke pot. You know, they do a lot of random drug testing at the schools. I'll tell you that. But it's the stress. It makes them crazy. That always breaks my heart. And so, you know, you and I are both fathers. How many kids do you have? Because I see your kids training. You've got 2 kids. You have a boy and a girl, or
Boy and girl. I got a girl that's going to be 2 in August, and then Raider is 8.5.
okay, yeah. So my kids are a little older. My daughter will be 14. My son will be 12. I'm always trying to you're a coach, so you know you see the potential of everything, but you have to be. It's careful. But I see your kids. Your son Raider is often in the videos. It looks like you guys are doing family stuff together. He seems like it's just but you're coaching him. It sounds like you're coaching just another person. You don't seem to be treating him differently because he's your son.
And that's one of the things that I talk to him about is I literally say, listen, I'm your coach right now in this session. I got to separate, and I go, I need you to learn how to separate me as your dad from your coach.
Interesting.
And I said, you're going to go through life with 100 coaches that you like and that you don't like and everything in between. I said, if however I relay information to you, your job is to disseminate what's valuable and take that in. I go, you and I may have been arguing for the last 2 days, but understand you have to trust that I'm giving you information that's going to help you improve. Your job is to learn how to, and that's a difficult process for a lot of young people. Some people never learn that is, okay, somebody is yelling at me and they just shut up. If they were to just filter out the volume and say, oh, okay, got it. Turn my knee out a little bit and I can produce more power. Got it. And that's what I try to teach Raider is just pull that information out, figure out what you can get out of the message.
Yeah, kids are pretty smart too. And also, you're right. Kids are they have to learn to be around coaches that they don't like. Like I tell my son, I never played baseball, so Daddy I can't coach you in baseball. But I do know when to tell the coach, look, dude, I don't want him throwing that much, you know, so on and so forth. Let's talk about a little selfish question here because you mentioned how stretching is important. I was talking about how sitting with my legs straight out is very hard for me. And I had my last knee surgery 11 years ago, but the past few years has been really painful. I can't even run. And to me, if you can't run, I don't like that. I think that's that's a bad thing. And I really started feeling it when I began driving a lot, commuting for this coaching and whatnot. So, you know, the doctors have been unable to really figure it out. To be honest with you, things work. Acupuncture worked the first time, there was relief. Then the second and third time they did acupuncture with electric stim, no relief. Physical therapy, massaging, and they did some P&F stretching of the hamstring and some distracting of the hip, gave relief to the knee. Next time, no relief. You know, I just had those orthovisc shots.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, all right, it's been years since I can't run, so let me get these orthovisc shots. But how important is stretching, especially, you know, I don't know, I'm not a big guy. You've seen big guys, but I guess I'm considered a big guy, pretty tight. What do you think of the static stretching and, you know, things of that nature? I don't do Muay Thai and stuff like that, and to me, that would have been my stretching, being able to do that kind of stuff.
Well, 2 things. Number one is another evolution of the way that we approached our strength and conditioning program was literally trying to get our athletes to understand that you're just stretching with weights.
Yes.
So everything that we do doesn't matter. No, I'm not saying everything. There are some
Right.
isolated things that we just, okay, we're going to fire up the rotator cuff and then we're going to integrate it into something. There isn't a lot of stretching of the rotator cuff that you're going to feel. But for the most part, a lot of the motions, the majority of the motions that we do, we want the athlete to find the stretch and then contract against the stretch, because that's where we found we would get the most long-lasting residual benefits.
So you're saying do full range movements, but
And
even
whatever, the full range is a relative term. It's going to be according to what you can control and what you can come out of. If you get to that point where what's called the class knife effect, if you get to a point where it's so far, I don't think I can come back from this, then that becomes obviously very dangerous. So working from, okay, here I feel a stretch, then stay there, contract against that stretch, and over time, because we always try to preach on the other side of the coin is increasing flexibility without increasing control is a recipe for disaster.
I haven't really met, Johnny always talks about on his podcast how, like, when this mobility thing came out and foam rolling and distracting with bands, people became hypermobile. I haven't met too many people who are hypermobile unless they just have zero muscle or they're a gymnast and they've been used to doing it. So now, a lot of people, hey, I say a lot of people, we hear coaches say, you don't need to stretch. You should just do soft tissue, self-myofascial release, and train through a full range of motion. But we are now quote unquote older. I don't know how many non-athletes you work with now. Just adults, especially men. We tend to kind of lose that range of motion. So static stretching, yes, no. I mean, is it such a bad
Yes,
thing?
absolutely. I think it is a fantastic thing to static stretch for a number of reasons. Number one is what most people forget is anytime that you go through a significant weight training bout, a training session, we look at the micro trauma that you just exhibited as an injury. And that was a huge thing for us, was to kind of change that focus of saying an injury just isn't a rolled ankle. An injury is any time that there is trauma.
Okay.
And so now with trauma, your body has an opportunity, what we always say is springboard effect. You could either get a little bit better by resting and recovering and yada, 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 or you can make huge changes by how you approach the recovery process. And so if I can get an athlete to buy into static stretching will make a huge change to your posture. And if your posture feels more vertically stacked, then everything else feels better. And so if I can get an athlete to just move some things, especially if you're sore, especially if there's a little bit of tightness, but you don't always feel micro trauma. And so just reintroducing the body to the range of motion it's supposed to be in is a huge benefit. And number two is it helps that recovery process. It helps you relax. It pulls down that nervous system. And anything I can do to get an athlete to just unplug.
Yeah.
And that's a huge benefit. So I'm a huge proponent. I don't care what it is. But again, I always maintain there should be some resemblance of control of increasing range of motion.
Nice.
Swimmers, you'll find that's a big thing for us is how did we address joint laxity, where you talk about a lot of swimmers are very, very blessed just because they're the athletes who didn't do well in field sports because of hypermobile knees. You take something as simple as mobility of the ankles. And so you take somebody whose foot is here and where your toes are pointing out, where that would be an average ankle. But a lot of high-level swimmers are here, where they just have that super, super plantar flexed ankle. Well, that is a huge advantage in the water. All of a sudden where you can get that dolphin kick and they're kicking through a big range of motion, where for me, I'm here and then that's my kick.
Yeah.
And it just kind of looks like a slapping a board through the water. But now all of a sudden these guys, where you got a hypermobile ankle and a hypermobile knee, Well, in another situation, that's a bad thing, but in the world of swimming, it's good. Now we have to take that into careful consideration as we're trying to put them through squats and lunges and step ups and lateral motions, and then especially when we start going into the running, because lack of control of that new range of motion would be a good thing. Is That's great that you have a hypermobile knee, but let's give you a little bit more control of that excessive range of motion.
Yeah, so stretching, you would say, for somebody like me, yes.
Absolutely. Huge.
Yeah, it was amazing that, like, just sitting. I mean, I knew that was a tight position for me, but he said John Brookfield was saying like 10 to 15 minutes a day is he accumulates sitting throughout the day of these positions. So yesterday I did it. I don't know how much time I did. I'll have to set a timer, but maybe around 10 minutes. But I was like, man, it made my knee feel better. My back felt better. I was like, I got to do this sitting tall stretch more.
There's a mindful timer. It's like a yoga timer. It's got a very melodic beep.
Mm-hmm.
We'll use that. We'll tell the guys to get it. And then you literally have like 4 or 5 stretches that we'll tell the guys to go through. So when you're sitting there and you hear the boom, then just switch position and sit there. And you could set it for whatever you want to set it.
Yeah.
So you can hold it for a minute and then go through that cycle 4 or 5 times. And you've gone through, I could sit there on the computer and do a bunch of work and switching positions 3 or 4 times. And I'm golden at the end of it.
Yeah.
And I got it done.
Yeah, we got to do a part 2. I don't want to kill your time here. I mean, we went an hour and 20 minutes. I still have so many questions. So what I'm going to recommend people do is you've got an Instagram account. You put a lot of videos up on there. You've got how many programs on Train Heroic? How many teams?
We actually stopped doing Train Heroic
okay.
there, but we are right now in the process of loading them back up. We're going to introduce 3 programs back up on Train Heroic.
Is it because you're so busy coaching? I mean, it seems like you're up quite early with the videos coaching, and
we got it for a number of reasons. Number one is that there are a couple of needs that we found of people our age, and we got a huge influx of questions. How can I get my son or daughter to train with me? Because for the longest time, it was like you go to Globo Gym and Zach and I will bang out some big weights, send the kids to a kids program where they're playing with clay, and then send the moms over to do a spin class. But now all of a sudden, people are starting to recognize, that's a golden opportunity for me to develop a positive relationship with my son. And I'm making sure that he's healthy, he's doing the right things. We're growing closer together, and it sounds terrible, but how many times did you grow closer with your teammates because you suffered together? So I could sit there and scream at my son to suffer is not the same effect as Raider and I holding a squat together, laughing, giggling.
Yeah.
Hurts, this is burning, ha, high five each other. I'll go 5 seconds if you go 5 seconds. Yeah. And so the benefit is just tremendous.
Well, that's what I see in the videos. It's like your wife is training with the kids, and I hear you.
She is out of our league. She just absolutely crushes, and we can't even touch her.
What's your wife's sport background? What's your wife's sport background? What's her?
She was a volleyball player, a collegiate volleyball player.
Okay, nice. So, when the mom and dad are athletes, I always find like that's where we have the best kids. Not so much because there's the meeting of genetics coming together, but the parents understand, as you were saying earlier, the 23 hours outside of training, things that need to go on. And so my wife was a pretty serious athlete, so was I, and so the things that happen. Hey, buddy, it's so cool. Also, like we get to watch our friends' kids growing, So like I have some old videos of my son.
Well, what you talk about is you get the genetics and you create that capacity, but just like you said, it's twofold. Obviously, strong athletes increase the probability that they're going to produce strong kids. But exactly that is the culture that the kids will grow up in. That capacity.
Yeah.
And that's what we try to teach Raider and Zia is, listen, you might have gotten amazing genetics from your mom and dad, but it's just going to stay bottled up if you don't do these things. And it's one of those, have you ever seen the movie Deadpool? Obviously.
Yeah.
And so we kind of use that Deadpool moment. That's what we always say is if we're about to go through some crazy hellacious thing, we say this is our Deadpool moment, and we're referring to when he goes into that oxygen deprivation tank and it's just miserable and it's terrible and all that suffering, but that's what released his mutant powers.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we talk about is this is that Deadpool moment.
The kids learning about the work. What about you, Raph, with your own training? Just real quick, like, are you squatting and deadlifting? I see you doing some sandbag work. Like, what's your own training look like?
My own training is the exact same thing that we take through the athletes. I want to touch heavy weights, at least 2 to 3 times a week. I want to move every day. And so it's funny that you say that is because I get these messages and I'll get these like comments where people go, oh, he doesn't touch enough weights. It's too hokey pokey. It's too much witchcraft voodoo. And I always try to get out there that there are a million videos of people deadlifting. There's a million videos of people benching and squatting. I go, I don't want to video me benching and squatting and deadlifting. I go, keep doing that.
Yeah.
Keep doing it that I'm doing. And then I'm just giving you something to tie it into the motion, into the movement, to playing volleyball better, into swimming better, into being a better operator. So all of those things, absolutely. I love touching heavy weights. I love lifting heavy. But like I said, I try to bridge that gap between the person who loves to sprint, the person who loves to bang heavy weights, and I try to find that bridge in between.
What about like if people who are listening or watching, they want to reach out to you, they want programming? How are you gonna? Do you do coaching through email now? Since you're not, is that how you'd work? Okay.
Email, obviously Zoom has blown up, so we have Zoom calls. So if you go to my Instagram page, you go to our Kaizen ASAP Facebook page, just send us a direct message, and we do online coaching. We do have a video series. We just launched our Down the Rabbit Hole, where we go through exactly what you and I are talking about. We just video my wife and I talking, or longer ones where we kind of ramble about the background story of what you're seeing in the video. So DM us, and we are more than happy to help somebody accomplish what they want to accomplish.
Yep, and I'll link everything up on my website, but people who are driving, listening, Kaizen ASAP, that's also the website.
Yes,
that's
sir.
the Instagram. And if you're lost with that, then send me an email and I'll put you in touch with Raph. But Raph, I mean, we could do this all day, my man. We'll have to reconnect for a part 2. This was great, my man. And I'm going to shut it down, so just hang tight 1 minute. Thanks to everybody listening to the Strong Life Podcast. There's Raider, watching you grow up on Instagram. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Raph, hang tight 1 second, buddy.